Bueno, y nosotros les vamos a dejar ahora en unos instantes con una entrevista con Carmignac, con la gestora que ha hecho nuestro compañero Javier del Valle, a la vuelta criptonegocios de la mano de Sergio Fernández. Que tengan un muy buen fin de semana.
Como sabéis, hasta ahora ha sido un año complicado, no solo para leer la macroeconomía, la situación actual económica, sino también por los mercados, que han sorprendido en esta primera mitad del año, sobre todo con las bolsas y también por el lado de la renta fija, con unos bancos centrales que por ahora continúan con esa subida de tipos. Y hoy tenemos con nosotros a Raphael Gallardo, Chief Economist on Macro Economy at Carmignac, para hablar de todo esto. How are you, Raphael? Thank you for coming.
I'm good. How are you?
Well, starting with the stock market, with the economy, we're seeing right now in the first half of the year a strong market so far, even with these macro headwinds. Why economy has been so resilient this year, and do you think this is going to change during the second half?
Yes, well, we can say that there are several reasons why the economies have been so strong. On the demand side, we know that we have inherited from the pandemic policy response excess cash on households' balance sheets. So in the US, we estimate this is 4% of GDP. In Europe, it's 3% of GDP. We also have excess cash on the balance sheet of corporates and local governments in Europe and the US. And in the US, we estimate it's 5% of GDP. So we have these buffers to demand, notably the fact that even if interest rates are higher, because companies have so much cash, they don't need to refinance some debt at higher rates. So that means that the lag of transmission of monetary policy tightening is actually longer. And on the other hand, we also have strong equity markets and resilient housing markets. So the wealth effects are also helping households to continue to spend. So on the equity market, the wealth effect is related to one major factor in our view, which is that companies have been able to defend their margins. Companies have more pricing power than we estimated. And so with this pricing power, they could pass to the end consumers the increase in labor costs and energy costs, for example. And so the equity market is saying, well, economists are talking about a recession, but in the end, in nominal terms, profits are still rising. So the equity market is strong, and so you have this wealth effect linked to the equity market. And second part of the wealth effect is the housing sector. In the housing sector, at least in the countries where mortgages are indexed to long-term interest rates, the fact that the yield curve has inverted very quickly in this cycle means that with lower bond yields at the long end, mortgages have not suffered as much as they would have when you think that, for example, in the US, short-term interest rates are 5%. And this is the first time since the Volcker shock at the beginning of the 80s that we've seen long-term interest rates peaking way before and below the peak in short-term interest rates. So that's why on the demand side, we have this resilience that is still preventing the economy from falling into recession. Now, the question is, so can we forget about a recession? No, because I think the recession is the playbook of the central banks right now. If we don't have a recession now because the economy is resilient, then the central banks are going to have to hit the economy stronger with higher interest rates.
And they also said it right now because the Fed also told us that a mild recession was coming. So we'll see in the second half of the year. And talking about all of this, if a recession is still on the playbook, when these wealth effects erase on the next year or even this second half of the year, what do you think happens to inflation and the outlook also for growth? Because some analysts also are talking about the possibility of deflation even.
So so central banks need to provoke a recession. So they will hike interest rate until they see a recessive dynamic clearly in the numbers. And on inflation, I think whatever happens to GDP, the path from inflation currently is still around 5% in the US, 6% in Europe, and core inflation. Bringing this back down to 3% is going to be an easy ride because it's mostly base effect, energy prices, food prices. What is going to be very painful is going the extra mile from 3% to 2%, which is the target. And this is where the central banks need to hurt the labor market. So 3% we'll get it there easily by the middle of next year. Going the extra mile to 2%, it will depend on how well the central banks resist to political pressure. Because once inflation is at 3%, I think a lot of governments in Europe and the US will be saying, why do you want to bother us with going back to 2% if that means destroying 1 million jobs in the US? So if central banks surrender, they capitulate completely and they say, okay, they don't say it explicitly, but they start slashing rates meaningfully when we reach 3%, then inflation will not come back to 2%. The economy will recover and we will go back into an even more inflationary cycle. But if the central banks stick to the current playbook, and which is to say, Powell doesn't want to be the next Arthur Burns. The superhero of all the central banks is Paul Volcker, and everybody's saying, I have the courage and the strength and the backbone of Paul Volcker, so I will go to the end of the job. And if they do that, yes, there is a risk that they trigger not only inflation going to 2%, but undershooting the 2% target, because we could have some financial instability. So we had a first warning in Europe with the UK crisis in last September, then in the US in March with the bankruptcy of 3 banks. So it could be that, yes, in the fight against the returning exactly to 2%, which triggers this kind of financial instability, and then the central bank lose control of the dynamic here, and they end up fighting a financial crisis, and then, as you said, the risk of deflation will go up massively.
And Raphael, what happens with all of this if it happens, if finally the central banks capitulate? How those investors need to position themselves? Which economies could do better than others?
Well, if we are to get into a higher inflation environment, then yes, there will be a response. I mean, the first response of investor will be to buy inflation hedges. So they will be buying gold, they will be buying oil, and because on commodity markets you can make they can be the recipients of financial speculation. So you can see a mania on oil futures, for example, and so all this commodity complex will go up, and then you want to be in economies that are not importing this kind of stuff. So the US is in a good position here because you will have they are a net oil exporter. They are self-sufficient in food. They have a lot of metals. So the US will have an advantage versus, say, the UK and the Euro area and Japan. And of course, in emerging markets, we know who are the big winners would be, the big exporters in Latin America, Indonesia, in Asia, for example.
So very interesting. Thank you very much, Raphael Gallardo, Chief Economist on Macroeconomy at Carmignac. We keep this playbook. We'll see for the year how is it going to develop. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. See you next time. Bye.